That's just to give you a minute to pause. I was sitting there feeling really anxious because I was thinking, oh, this is going over, and I've spent so much time preparing for my piece. And then I said, you know what, I'm just going to say what I have to say. And we're sometimes such prisoners to time in ways that actually betray the very things that we say that we're about. So I want to say good morning to everyone, and God, it's such an honor and privilege to join you today. I want to begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to Shanine for this invitation, and to Louise Sheridan, and all of you whose commitment and generosity have really made this gathering possible. Because something like this just doesn't happen, unless people come together and make it happen. I'm deeply grateful for the invitation to stand here in solidarity with people from different parts of the world who have dedicated their lives to the work of community development. I want to thank you for the work that brought you to this room. Whether you come to this work as an organizer, an educator, a practitioner, an activist, a scholar, a policymaker, or a community leader, you've chosen to be here. And often, against overwhelming odds, we do this work. We know that communities matter, that democratic life matters, and that ordinary people working together can in fact change the world. We say that all the time. This conviction is no small thing. And we gather in this city, in Glasgow, a city that, like most cities around the world, carries difficult memories of empire, of inequality, of exclusion, of histories too often celebrated selectively or forgotten altogether. It is a city whose streets carry the memory of labor struggles, of migration, of industrial transformation, of colonial entanglements, and of generations of ordinary people who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. As I move towards naming the crisis, there's 3 quotes that are significant for me, that in my life I try to embody them in relationship to my scholarship and in my relationships with others. The first is from Frantz Fanon, who said, everything can be explained to people on the single condition that you want them to understand. Rosa Luxemburg stated, the masses are in reality their own leaders, organically creating their own development process. And my beloved Paulo Freire, no one educates anyone else, nor do we educate ourselves. We educate one another in the context of living in this world. We meet at a time when the world feels increasingly uncertain. Every morning brings another headline announcing crisis, and if you live in the United States, sometimes you don't even want to open up the news. Wars, climate disasters, fascist governments, deepening inequality, mass displacement, rising racism, religious intolerance, gender violence, homophobic and transphobic harassments, attacks on democratic institutions, the erosion of public education, the privatization of health care, and the commercialization of every single aspect of our humanity, of human life. Many people describe this historical uncertainty as unprecedented. Others speak of crisis, still others speak of chaos. But for indigenous peoples whose lands were stolen and poisoned for centuries, this is not a sudden crisis or a moment of chaos. It is and has been a historical reality. For Black communities subjected to slavery, segregation, incarceration, and state violence, uncertainty and crisis did not suddenly arrive with climate change. For Palestinians and other colonized people living under occupation, for migrants crossing militarized borders, for impoverished workers laboring under brutal economic conditions, crisis and chaos have been an ongoing condition imposed by enduring structures of empire. We must begin by questioning the very language we use. Words shape how we understand reality. They shape how what we believe is even possible. Today, we are told we live in a chaotic world, but what kind of chaos are we actually confronting? When we hear the word chaos, we tend to imagine disorder without cause, something accidental, unpredictable, unpreventable, something spinning beyond human control. Yet much of what we call chaos today is neither accidental nor inevitable. It has been organized, it has been produced, and it has been fabricated and normalized. Climate change did not emerge from nowhere. Mass displacement and forced migration are not accidental. Mass poverty is not accidental. The concentration of extraordinary wealth alongside extraordinary deprivation is not an accident. It is, in fact, one of the most pressing global challenges of the 21st century. Across the world, entire populations struggle today under the weight of austerity, unable to meet their basic needs, while extreme wealth consolidates among a small transnational capitalist class. According to Oxfam, the world's richest 1% have increased their wealth by nearly $40 trillion over just the last decade, an amount that the organization estimates could end global poverty more than 22 times over. And yet millions continue to experience food insecurity, inadequate health care, limited educational opportunity, and extreme conditions of poverty. This stark disparity is not simply an unfortunate side effect of growth. It is evidence that growth itself has never shared equitably, nor given a damn. It underscores the urgent need for policies of redistribution, of social protection, and genuinely inclusive development. These conditions are predictable outcomes of political and economic systems that have for centuries privileged material accumulation over human dignity and well-being, ecological extraction over respect for nature, competition over cooperation, and profit over life itself. They built over centuries of colonial conquest. They were built on patriarchal rule, the capitalist mode of production, militarism, and ecological indifference. And if we understand the nature of the chaos surrounding us, we will surely, if we don't understand it, we will surely misunderstand our responsibility within it and our role within communities. Community development cannot begin merely by asking, how might communities better adapt to crisis? Although the urgency discourses of experts so often do precisely this. We must begin by asking a far more difficult question. Who is producing and benefiting from conditions of crisis, and what is to be done to transform the injustices that sustain them? Too often we are encouraged to think about crisis surrounding us as though they were separate and unrelated, rooted in modernist values of individualism, of reductionism, and decontextualized analysis. We converse in separate rooms, seldom coming together. Climate change is discussed in one room, housing in another, food insecurity in another, education in still another, migration somewhere else, policing in some different room, poverty, education, public health, violence, mental health, and democratic decline are each assigned their own discipline, their own ministry, their own profession and conference, each confined to their own neat little boxes. This is what I call a politics of disconnection, and it is too often reinforced by the very people who claim they want to provide humanitarian aid. But life is messy. It does not exist in tidy categories, nor does it live in the kingdom of comfort. It lives in the most unruly expressions of the mind, of the heart, of the body, and the spirit. And it is precisely this unruliness, the disobedience to social control, that inflames those in power to promote a culture of alienation and control. Alienation from ourselves, alienation from one another, and ultimately alienation from life itself. The well-meaning fragmented theories that pass for community development at times too often function like the white noise of capitalism, bouncing off subaltern communities without ever truly reaching them. So communities for whom it is very much in our interest to harness a power that exists outside of those boxes of established rules and procedures, we will always work to defy and dismantle the neat little boxes that institutions try to impose on us. We do this because, as Audre Lorde reminds us, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issues lives. A family displaced by flooding is also confronting economic insecurity. A young person burdened by impossible housing costs is also anxious about climate change and future survival. A migrant or asylum seeker fleeing war encounters racism. They encounter economic exclusion and political hostility all at once in the places where they're seeking to be safe. A neighborhood deprived of public resources is often the very same neighborhood exposed to environmental contamination, underfunded schools, inadequate healthcare, and the kind of aggressive policing that drives mass incarceration. What is essential here is that we recognize that what confronts us today is not a collection of disparate crises. It is the crisis of capitalism itself. A political economic system that subordinates life to profit, democracy to markets, and the future to endless accumulation despite its glaring unsustainability. We must understand capitalism as a totalizing force, one that ignites and fuels the fires of crisis, while readily deploying every hegemonic form of identity politics in pursuit of wealth and power. The question then is no longer how to stabilize the system, but how to dismantle and transform it before its contradictions consume the social and ecological fabric upon which the planet's survival depends. It is no surprise then that we are also living through a profound rupture in our relationships with the natural world. For centuries, transnational corporations and the governments that support them have treated nature not as the living foundation of human existence, but as a stockpile of resources to be extracted, commodified, and consumed. The accelerating climate crisis, species extinction, wide-reaching pollution, and ecosystem collapse are the direct consequences of the economic system that demands limitless growth on a finite planet. Repairing this relationship demands more than technological fixes or grandiose theoretical abstractions. It demands a fundamental transformation in how we understand our place within the web of life, recognizing that the life of communities depends entirely on the health of the ecosystem that sustains them. We are experiencing, too, a crisis in our relationship with democracy. Across much of the world, democratic institutions remain formally intact, even as participation is hollowed out. Decisions that shape our lives are made increasingly by wealthy corporations, financial markets, and unelected technocrats, rather than communities themselves. As politics grows more responsive to capital rather than human life, growing numbers lose faith in democracy, not because they reject democratic or egalitarian values, but because they no longer experience existing institutions as a meaningful form of self-governance. There is also, along with all this, an academic crisis. Universities where most community development faculty teach and many practitioners were prepared, they stand on the edge of collapse, no matter how nice the buildings are. the neoliberal withdrawal of public funds, the rise of an entrenched managerial class, the strangling of culture of endless assessment, the disorienting arrival of AI, and the steady erosion of intellectual freedom and shared governance are all deeply implicated here. And there's less and less funding. Never forget, less and less funding for community development initiatives, unless that work bends to the debilitating logic of neoliberalism, which treats communities as self-reliant entities responsible for solving their own challenges through entrepreneurship and market-based solutions, prizing individual responsibility and efficiency while reducing participation to the delivery of services rather than the challenge of structural inequality. Most academic institutions and NGOs have grown so accustomed to chasing money that many of their members feel unable or afraid to do the critical work so urgently needed for fear of losing funds. And many have become so alienated from their purpose, they no longer know how to practice true solidarity with communities. At the core sit ethical questions of honesty, not betraying or harming communities we work alongside, producing honest analysis with them rather than about them, and refusing to write those little secret studies and reports that those same communities can never access. These are political and ethical concerns, and they demand the sustained attention of every scholar and practitioner in this field. And ultimately, all this provokes a deep crisis in our relationships with one another, structured through limiting racial, ethnic, gender, sexual, ability-based, or religious identities. The logic of capitalism has alienated us from organic human existence and our inner sensibilities, rendering even relationships of love into transactional exchanges, devoid of intimacy and tenderness. We face, in short, a profound crisis in that what it means, the very meaning of what it means to be human today. What does it mean for us to be human today? And what it means to live together sustainably and equitably. Another pressing concern is the sheer persistence of oppression. Despite decades of debates and theories of change, of social justice, disseminated ad nauseum, the underlying structures of inequality have largely remained unchanged because the inherent epistemology that drives these debates has remained static. It serves the larger needs of capital. Consequently, colonialism did not disappear, it adapted. Patriarchy did not dissolve because societies grew more technologically sophisticated. Racism did not vanish because laws changed. Systems of domination simply morphed, becoming more sophisticated, more adept at absorbing the language of multiculturalism, inclusion, diversity, and preserving the hegemony of every form of exclusion at the same time. A great contradiction of our age is that never have societies spoken so frequently about race and diversity or social justice. And yet inequality continues to deepen. Never have institutions spoken so much about participation, and yet democratic participation continues to erode. Never have governments spoken so passionately about resilience, and yet millions are expected to become resilient to conditions that no human being should ever be asked to endure. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, community development risks becoming less concerned with transforming unjust social arrangements than with managing their consequences. Communities, in the name of self-reliance, become responsible for solving problems, again, that they did not create. Public services disappear, replaced by calls for entrepreneurship. Corporations extract wealth from neighborhoods and later sponsor little business empowerment initiatives. Governments impose austerity and then celebrate local innovation. Communities are praised for surviving conditions that most of us wouldn't know what to do with if we found ourselves in those situations. Resilience is celebrated while justice remains obscured and silenced. Resources poured into building individual self-esteem or self-reliance without ever addressing the environmental stressors that interfere with the very sense of belonging that resilience requires. But resilience detached from justice becomes perilous. We must ask, resilience against what? Resilience for whom? Resilience under whose conditions? And what are the consequences of marching down the long path of neoliberal resilience? To say, oh, this is not an act of pessimism. It is an act of political clarity. Unless we understand how today's realities have been produced, we will spend our precious life energy treating symptoms year after year after year while leaving untouched the conditions that generate suffering. Too often our work still feels like standing at the bottom of a river, desperately pulling people from the current as they struggle to survive. We respond with compassion, skill, commitment. Yet there comes a moment when we must ask a harder question. Who exactly, and I'll go ahead and say who the hell, is pushing people into the river in the first place? Responding to crisis is essential, yes, but it isn't enough. It will never, ever be enough. The purpose of community development, therefore, cannot be to help people, and so, this helping people to adapt more comfortably to systems of oppression. The purpose must be to transform the inhumane, debilitating conditions that produce the oppression. This distinction changes everything because it shifts our attention from systems to structures, from adaptation to transformation, from charity to solidarity, from management to democratic participation. History teaches us something both sobering and inspiring. Every generation inherits a world it did not create. But every generation also decides whether it will merely administer that world and keep it going, or work to transform it. This brings us to the uncomfortable but unavoidable question: what kind of community development do we need today? This is where the labor of community development must courageously meet the struggle. Not as charity, not as a technical management, not as the administration of poverty, but as a democratic process through which ordinary people come together to transform the conditions of their collective existence. That is the tradition that first inspired so many of us, and I believe it is the radical tradition that we need to reclaim today. The question is no longer how communities can survive chaos, but whether community development will confront the source of the chaos. Are we willing to embody a community development that disentangles itself from the fabricated politics of urgency and walks upstream to confront the systems, policies, and material conditions that create vulnerable populations in the first place? If so, our task is not to become rescuers or saviors, but courageous freedom fighters for justice and equity, committed to interrupting and transforming the logic, the practices, the institutional arrangements that help keep tossing people and whole communities into the river. So I touched it, huh? Okay, am I back? I'm back. All right. Another pressing issue is the professionalization of community development work. I know that sounds counterproductive for some, but it is a real problem, which wittingly or unwittingly distances it from grassroots efforts. Too often, community development becomes a career path rather than a calling, a set of deliverables rather than shared destiny, a grant cycle rather than a lifelong commitment. This is not a moral indictment of the individuals working in this space, many of whom are deeply committed and profoundly exhausted by the contradictions they navigate. It is a political critique. What community development is governed when it's governed by short-term funding, by measurable outcomes and institutional risk management, its capacity to challenge power becomes constrained. Radical demands are softened. Structural critiques are replaced by best practices. Anger, especially the anger of oppressed people, is treated as a problem to be managed rather than a legitimate response to injustice. With management, then, the notion of management offered as a surface solution that preserves the pseudo-harmony of gross structures of inequity. Yet every meaningful advance in social justice has come from organized collective disruption, not from polite requests, not from pilot programs, not from partnerships that quietly replicate hierarchy. Community development must reclaim its roots in social movements, anti-capitalist struggle, anti-colonial resistance, feminist organizing, abolitionist visions, and popular education. All of these have to touch our work. It must be willing to be uncomfortable, conflictual, unruly, sassy, if you have to, and intolerant of the structures that reproduce human suffering. To speak of human development in a global context without confronting the coloniality of power is to engage in historical amnesia. Colonialism is not a past event. It is an ongoing structure that determines whose lives are valued, whose knowledge counts, and whose communities are deemed disposable. Across the global south and within marginalized communities of the global north, development has too often meant displacement, extraction, cultural erasure. Communities are developed off their lands, out of their homes. Their economies are restructured to serve global capital. Their ways of knowing are dismissed as backward or irrelevant. Decolonizing community development requires more than inclusion or representation. It requires rethinking whose knowledge guides our work, being attentive to indigenous epistemologies that understand land not as property, but as relationship. Honoring Black radical traditions that have long theorized survival, resistance, and collective care under conditions of terror. Embracing feminist practices that treat care, embodiment, and relationality as political rather than peripheral, and cultivating personal humility, the willingness to be taught by communities rather than to manage them. Decolonial community development is not about bringing solutions to communities, it's about standing with communities in struggle, recognizing them as legitimate creators of theory, of strategy, and of visions, something that they were doing long before the field of community development arrived at their door. Emancipatory community development is also about confronting the myths that can derail community empowerment. Paulo Freire argued that oppression is sustained through the myths that portray existing social and economic inequalities as somehow natural and inevitable. Through critical dialogue and the development of critical consciousness, communities can challenge these myths, name and contest the structural causes of injustice, and become empowered to act collectively for social change. For Freire, myths are not simply false beliefs. They are actual ideological narratives that maintain systems of oppression in place by presenting unequal social configurations as natural, inevitable, or beneficial, discouraging critical thought and preventing oppressed communities from engaging the structural causes of their circumstances. Dominant myths still work. And these include, for example, the belief that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. That if they work hard enough, they just get those boots, lace up those bootstraps, right? That the interests of the ruling class represent the interests of everyone. That poverty and inequality result from the individual failings rather than systemic injustice. Unfortunately, the rhetoric of community development is not free of these myths. We're often encouraged to think individually, and to accept the best practices drawn from one community, thinking they will automatically transfer to others. Never mind that this last myth renders communities passive. I mean, I'm sorry, I just get so frustrated because having done a lot of community work, people would come in and they'd have these theories and they'd have this, these packages and these curriculums and shite. And we were just supposed to gobble them up, accept them, whether they worked or not. There was no sense that that within our own context, we had to build our own strategies, our own visions, our own ways of working. From this vantage point, our responsibility shrinks to facilitating, coordinating, consulting, and managing. And of course, embracing the myth of neutrality. But oppression is never neutral. When children go hungry in societies of extraordinary, there's an extraordinary abundance and children are dying from hunger, neutrality carries real consequences. When entire communities are displaced for the sake of economic development, neutrality carries real consequences. When racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant hatred, homophobia, transphobia diminish the humanity of our neighbors, neutrality carries consequences. What is at stake is the question of culture and power, money and power, how these are implicated in oppression. And then, of course, they're implicated in our own emancipatory struggles as well. History teaches us that every time the possibilities of justice and equality have expanded in workers' struggles, civil rights struggles, revolutionary movements, insurrections, it has required people willing to disturb the comfort of the status quo. The abolition of slavery was not politically neutral, neither was the labor movement, nor civil rights, nor the struggle against apartheid, nor anti-colonial resistance, nor the movements for gender justice. None of these have been neutral. Every major advance in human freedom has required individuals and communities willing to take risks, confront power, and act together. Ordinary people, as has been said, ordinary people who chose courage over comfort, action over passivity, love over hate. And this history belongs to us, the inheritance of an emancipatory practice of community development, if we choose to claim it, not to produce the old movements, but because this practice confronts the culture of silence, while remaining uncompromisingly committed to cultivating the conditions under which communities can become subjects of their own histories and authors of our own destinies. But to do this requires far more than expertise. I'm sorry, I know I am, and I'm sorry if I offend you, but I am just so frustrated with some of this language and these practices that have gotten us nowhere. It requires moral imagination and at times righteous indignation. Perhaps another danger confronting community development today is the gradual, steady, algorithmic colonization of our imaginations. People are told in subtle and not so subtle ways that there is no alternative, that things simply are as they are, that poverty is inevitable because, of course, the poor will always be with us, that environmental destruction is unavoidable because there have always been natural disasters, that endless economic accumulation is sustainable, and that democracy must always be handmaiden to the marketplace. Over time, these assumptions calcify into what Antonio Gramsci called common sense. And when imagination is colonized, resignation follows close behind, and people acquiesce against their own interests. They stop asking what kind of society they wish to create and begin asking, how do I survive in the one that already exists? Community development must resist this narrowing of possibility. Its purpose cannot be to camouflage and shroud anguish. Its purpose must be to widen our political imagination so that we imagine otherwise, remembering, as Freire insisted, that history always remains unfinished. Imagination matters profoundly here because in a chaotic world full of anxiety and doubt, the act of imagining together with trust and openness moves us closer towards collective action. Collective action in this sense is an ethical and political condition necessary to the struggle for community empowerment and self-determination. Collective action requires spaces of encounter, of dialogue, of trust, of humility, and shared analysis. It requires political clarity, so often obscured by contradictions. And it requires time, something the accelerated, productivity-driven culture of capitalism rarely permits us. Given the labor that community development demands, we must defend time for relationship building, for collective study together, for strategic planning that comes grounded in communities, for mourning our losses, for celebration, for dreaming futures, for simply being able to be human. These are not luxuries. They are the foundation of resistance. And perhaps that's why time is gobbled up, why we're pushed into these boxes where we never have time for anything, and we lose touch even with ourselves. We must also recognize the collective action is messy. It's going to be messy. If you want things to be neat, get the hell out of the kitchen. Get out, because life is messy. It involves conflict. It surfaces differences. It demands accountability, and it requires us to confront the internalized oppressions and unaddressed traumas that can fracture relationships and fragment solidarity. Yet solidarity here is not the absence of differences. It is the commitment to struggle through difference in pursuit of shared ideas, relationships, and strategies, comradeship, in the interest of justice and democratic possibility. A commitment to the difficult work of listening passionately and engaging honestly with the truth of one another's struggle and suffering. This is a listening. I think listening is the most revolutionary practice that can inform our work, really listening to each other. To practice emancipatory community development requires an ability to listen beyond the din of official rhetoric, of studies, of reports, listening not to confirm our assumptions, not to prepare our responses, but listening in ways that allow us to be touched and transformed by one another. Community development then is not about participating in the transformation of communities. It's about learning with communities, working with communities, allowing them to teach us from the inside out, that we might then be able to labor together horizontally as companions rather than as managers. So it's not, I don't think about, oh, let's get something down. On the contrary, let's deal on just these powerful horizontal levels that we are human beings. We come from different contexts, different realities, that we have something, I have something to learn. Every single person, if I sat with you in this, if I had a moment to sit with each of you, I would learn something from you because you've had a different life, you've had a different reality. And we sometimes forget that because we get so caught up in all of the reports and all of, all those managerial things. And yet, despite the profound challenges of our time, there are reasons to hope. Across the world, communities are creating extraordinary forms of collective action. During the disastrous moments of the last decade, when COVID hit and hurricanes and earthquakes and tsunamis struck different parts of the world, neighbors, they organized mutual aid networks long before NGOs or government officials ever responded. During economic crisis, communities have established food cooperatives, solidarity economies, and resource sharing initiatives. During political repression, grassroots organizations have built networks of protection and resistance. Cuba offers a striking example of mutual aid amid deep economic crisis today, provoked by US embargo that has increasingly restricted food and fuel and medication to a small country that is impoverished. Even so, Cubans persist with the emphasis on collective solidarity and community mobilization. In Puerto Rico, where I'm from, when Hurricane Maria hit, it was the neighborhood organizations, and health workers then coming in, and volunteers, people who they just did it because that's what they needed to do. They worked tirelessly to evacuate vulnerable residents, to distribute essential supplies, and support those affected long before formal aid arrived. And in some instances, it never arrived in Puerto Rico. These practices embody mutual aid, communities cooperating to meet shared needs through collective action rather than relying solely on market solutions or external assistance. This is an emancipatory practice of community development grounded in solidarity, participation, and collective responsibility. More importantly, these efforts reveal something fundamental about our nature as human beings. Contrary to dominant narratives that celebrate competition and individualism and make it common sense for people to compete with each other, people repeatedly demonstrate the human capacity for cooperation, for solidarity, and for care. Mutual aid is not charity, it's not philanthropy, it's not a benevolent gift bestowed by those with power upon those without it. It is recognition of interdependence. It emerges from the understanding that our liberation is always bound together. It is always bound together. When communities organize mutually, they create more than practical systems of support. They cultivate new relationships that challenge dominant assumptions about scarcity and competition, demonstrating that alternatives grounded in solidarity are not only possible, but they're already happening. Such forms of community development may appear like this very small-scale thing compared to global systems of power. Yet history teaches us that the most transformational movements often begin precisely in those spaces. For in essence, community is where we become personal. Community is where democracy learns to breathe. Community is where hope becomes organized. Community is where another world first becomes imaginable. And community is where histories continuously begin again. All of this continuously brings us back to collective action, but the issue is, how do we define collective action? Do we define it in solidarity with others, aimed at change realized both socially and materially? It's not just about feeling good. We want material change. As I said earlier, the challenges before us cannot be confronted through individual virtue alone. No single person can reverse climate change or any of the other atrocities. We don't need the Lone Ranger and his sidekick, Tonto, which is a colonial trope if there ever was one, right? No single organization can dismantle structural racism. No isolated community action can transform global systems of inequality, and no single march can end the repressions of sexualities. Emancipatory possibility is shaped above all by communal relationships that are capable of sustaining long and determined struggle, and by meaningful comradeships of love. One of the things that this brings us to is to the politics of hope. That hope cannot remain a transcendent feeling. Hope must become a practice with boots on the ground. Hope must be organized and educated, disciplined, sustained by memory, and strengthened by love. Freire reminds us that hope without action becomes empty promise, and action without hope demoralizes conviction. Community development requires we cultivate hope as an indispensable quality of our labor, confronting reality with honesty, while refusing to surrender our conviction in the possibility of change, abandoning cynicism, and taking up the labor that we do with passion, with joy, but most of all with love. So I speak of love here not as sentimentality, but as a radical political force. In a world organized by disposability, to insist on the humanity of the communities is an act of defiance. To nurture collective care in the face of systematic cruelty is revolutionary. Love in this sense is not passive, it is disciplined, it is demanding. It calls us to be responsible for ourselves, for one another, and for the generations who are still to come. Community development grounded in love refuses to reduce people to data points or service recipients. It recognizes pain without pathologizing it. It cultivates hope without denying reality, and it understands that joy, creativity, and celebration are not distractions from our labor. They are the very sustenance of what we do. So as I close, let me be direct here, as if I haven't been, right? You know, you have to laugh in the middle of all this craziness, because I always feel that if we can't laugh, that we've really gotten captured by the state. So we are at a crossroads, and the crossroads do not wait for anyone. We do not need a community development that merely manages chaos. We need one that interrupts it, that names power, redistributes resources, trusts communities as political agents, and aligns policy with justice, participation, with power, resilience, and empowerment. The crisis before us is not temporary disruptions. They are signs of a system in profound decline. The question is not whether change will come, but what kind of change and who will shape it. So I'm asking you plainly, when you leave this hall, do not leave your urgency behind with your notes, or back to your universities and I'm asking you to refuse the comfortable research question in favor of the necessary ones. To go back to your organizations and say no out loud to the grant that asks you to manage poverty rather than to end it. Go back to your neighborhoods and build the mutual aid network, the tenants union, the solidarity fund, the study circles, before the next disaster forces us to have to build it in a panic. And go back to your conscience and ask honestly whether your work this year served the comfort of institutions or the liberation of people. Will community development be a tool for managing inequality or a force for dismantling it? That choice will not be made in this hall. It will be made in the 1,000 small decisions that each of us make when we go home. Which grant we refuse, which silence we break, which community we choose to stand beside when it costs us something real. This requires courage. The courage to name power, to take sides, to stand with communities, even when it costs us funding, status, or institutional approval. History does not remember those who played it safe. It remembers those who dared to risk everything for a more just and loving world. Thank you.
Professor Antonia Darder. Now we have tea and